Good morning, Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, Representative Connolly. My name is Dr. M. Sanjayan. I'm the CEO of Conservation International, a nonprofit supporting conservation in over 50 countries. My Vice Chairman, Mr. Harrison Ford, and board members, Mr. Idris Elba, regret not being here today to support this testimony because of work. Thank you for inviting me to share my perspective on the forest conservation and fight against climate change and how Amazon 21 can transform our efforts. Conservation International's mission is to protect nature that is most important to people. And everything we do is aimed at ensuring that people and nature thrive together. Since 1987, we brought together businesses, governments, and communities to protect and restore nature. And everywhere we work, our model helps communities create self-sustaining, conservation-based economies. The Amazon 21 Act would substantially strengthen these efforts. At its core, this legislation incentivizes developing nations to protect and restore nature. It rewards action that maintains the health of some of our most critical, most iconic ecosystems while unlocking financial opportunities for local communities and landowners that commit to conservation. This bill is good for wildlife, it's good for ecosystems, it's good for the climate. But it's also, in equal measure, good for local communities and indigenous peoples, good for economies and security, not only food security and climate security, but also national security. In short, it's good for us. The science on this is clear. Nature is the building block required for a stable future for all of humanity. And yet nature is under assault virtually everywhere, with little to no investment to reverse or halt this trend. Today, only 3% of all available global climate finance is dedicated to protecting nature. There is a massive gap between what we need and what we have. And yet the demand for private sector nature-based investments and opportunities is sky high. It's clearly there. Right now, there are literally billions of dollars in private capital for nature-based investments sidelined by uncertainty and sidelined by risk. In just the last 2 or 3 years, for example, we've seen private sector interest in carbon markets soaring, and it could easily exceed $50 billion before the end of this decade. Through carbon markets, companies and individuals can invest in the protection of nature, thus shortening the timeline to achieve our climate goals. By enabling private-public partnerships, this bill would allow new investments to reach places where policy and markets do not. We're not tilling new soil here. In 1984, Congress established the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to work with both the public and private sectors to protect nature. And since then, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has become the largest private conservation grant maker in the United States. The Amazon 21 Act brings this concept of public-private partnerships to a global stage. More than half the world's GDP already depends in some ways on the benefits provided by nature. The loss of these benefits would be catastrophic and would amount to a loss of $2.7 trillion. As always, the poorest countries, the neediest rural communities would be the hardest hit, accelerating resource depletion, famines, climate-fueled migration, a recipe, as we all know, for global instability. Amazon 21 would dramatically and cost-effectively stave off these effects. In the places where I have spent my formative years, South Asia, West and East Africa, California, and Montana, I have seen firsthand how climate change has made life harder for everyone and virtually impossible for some. This legislation would help secure the nature that people need to survive, and it would maintain our country's global leadership and rich conservation legacy. In the United States, our most beloved landscapes and iconic wildlife remain today because of our long history of bipartisan conservation. The entire team and board of directors at Conservation International thank Majority Leader Hoyer for his leadership in crafting Amazon 21, and this committee and all of you for holding this important hearing. Thank you.
Thank you.
The potential for this moving forward
to really complement and to push forward so many other management techniques that we need to go with this for other countries. And as you mentioned, something else I saw at COP26, the enormous potential of private investment that exists. So I really think this is critical legislation that couldn't come at a more important time. So if you can comment on how this would increase that kind of partnership and among countries and on the private side as well.
Thank you, Representative Keating. I think you're completely right. The world is really looking for American leadership on this issue. Part of that is because American companies are looking for a signal around security to invest in nature. The one thing I know for sure is the nature tomorrow will be more valuable than it is today. That is an absolute truism. And the signals that we give here with Amazon 21 will enable companies to invest in nature and invest in carbon with more certainty in these countries that are rich in carbon and poor in other resources. I can also tell you that you're absolutely right that, in all my life, I mean, my father worked in the timber industry at the very sort of when I was a child in West Africa. I've never seen a country that has deforested itself emerge as a stable, successful democracy in any easy way. So what we are setting up here is a foundational building block that will have ripple effects into the economies of these countries, into preventing loss of water, loss of habitat, livelihoods. Deforestation is difficult. People do it when they're really forced to do it. And all we're trying to do with this act is give them that incentive and opportunity to protect and restore forests at scale, like they're doing in Kenya, like they're doing in Ethiopia, like they're doing in Colombia, and there's several countries. Costa Rica is another great example, and thus help that move towards a more sustainable economy and a more stable democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjayan.
Fantastic. I want to ask another question of Dr. Sanjayan. In your testimony, you make a compelling case for investing in nature conservation and for the considerable returns that could be generated in terms of preventing more instability and sources of conflict in the future. What are the barriers the private sector is facing in actually making these investments, and what role can Congress play in unlocking them?
Thank you, Congressman. The biggest barrier that I see right now is the barrier of supply. So we know the forests are there, we know communities are eager to engage, but the policies and the financial frameworks are not necessarily available for them to participate in a market. This is where USAID and other institutions can significantly help countries, communities, states, provinces develop the tools and technologies from a policy perspective, a science perspective, and also a financial perspective, actually engage the market at scale. I think that is literally the #1 stumbling block, and that's where U.S. leadership and the signal that it would create would instantly allow that flow to happen, where the private sector can invest in forest conservation for the benefit of people and nature, and ultimately our climate as well.
We have seen growing concerns about the risks of triggering biosphere tipping points across a range of ecosystems around the world and the potential domino effects. Could you explain more about this concept and what you see as being the tipping point for forests like the Amazon experiencing deforestation and droughts?
Sure, very briefly. So it turns out that the Amazon, like major rainforests, generate their own rainfall. And what that means, it's a self-sustaining system, kind of like a glass bubble, and you have like an aquarium. And as you get beyond a certain tipping point, its ability to regenerate and create that rainfall is fundamentally altered. That's something we've only recently learned. And two scientists, Dr. Tom Lovejoy, who recently passed away, and a big champion for the Amazon, really made the public aware of this tipping point. And the other is Dr. Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Science, who really established these ideas of the planetary tipping point. Now, if you ask me for a number, I would say it's probably around 20 to 25%. Once we destroy about 20 to 25% of a large rainforest like the Amazon, its ability to regenerate itself becomes difficult. If you live in Montana and you know, once a forest disappears and it's a grassland, to put it back into a forest, it's very, very difficult, if not nearly impossible.
So I assume that what we're talking about is if we don't act, this adds a sense of urgency to our actions in this regard, because if we hit that tipping point, we can't fix the problem that's been created.
That's absolutely right.
Thank you.
What about, I mean, both Mr. Perry and Ms. Titus have asked us about other threats in the Mekong Delta, in the case of Ms. Titus, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo because of the exploitation of cobalt, among other purposes. So maybe, Dr. Sanjayan, we might begin with you in terms of what about, we'll start with Mekong Delta, but these other major rainforest areas that provide so much in terms of flora, fauna, drinking water, and serve as important sinks, carbon sinks for the planet, shouldn't we be worried about those too?
Absolutely. So it's a great question, and I just want to point out one thing, that this bill has full transparency built into it in terms of ensuring that the funding gets to the right people in the right way. It involves participation of indigenous and local communities, not just in the full design of projects, and it has strong transparency requirements. Now, the Mekong Delta is a place that Conservation International has worked in for 2 decades. And I can tell you that it's extraordinarily carbon rich. It truly is one of these irreplaceable carbon sinks, if you will. But the threats to it are many, and deforestation is one threat. The other threat is, of course, water, and the third one I would say would be overfishing. Tonle Sap, for example, produces more fish than all of the United States freshwater fisheries combined. So this bill works on one major part. It clearly is not there to deal with every threat out there. However, a major reason for water instability in the Mekong Delta is because of deforestation. And Cambodia, interestingly, is a country poised to really open up its carbon markets as a way of protecting forests. They need those investments, and we are in the process of designing projects in Cambodia with very specific forest conservation targets in mind. So in terms of a place that's important for carbon, important for people, but also will benefit from this bill, Cambodia and the Mekong Delta would clearly be so-called in its crosshairs. Thank you. This bill would allow financial flows to happen very quickly. And that's partly because the private sector is eager for mechanisms like this in order to participate. So the lag time between developing project and funding actually flowing in these projects would be, in my estimation, like 18 months. So that is a reasonable time frame. It's not many, many years later before benefits start flowing. So I think it is a good mechanism to deal with this issue that you raised, which is people do need to eat, and desperate people are put into desperate situations where deforestation becomes their last means of survival. And we could stop that fast with an act like this.
How far does sovereign control go over what is a global resource? So is it my absolute right as a sovereign nation, if something is entirely within my sovereign territory, to destroy it, even if it has planetary consequences? And that's an unanswerable question at this time. But looking toward the future, it seems to me that one of our challenges is going to be to create global structures, international structures, that do protect assets that go beyond my sovereign territory without, compromising or surrendering sovereign control. But on the other hand, there are some, you don't get to destroy the planet because you decide economically, I want to exploit this unique resource that affects everybody, not just me. And how do we address that?
Congressman, if you go to New York City and you go to Central Park and think about how expensive that real estate must be right there, and you see all these buildings built up right to the edge of Central Park. Imagine someone trying to grab a bit of Central Park and putting up a skyscraper. Imagine the hue and cry that you would get in New York and around the world, and certainly around this country. And the reason you'll get that is not because it's not valuable, it's simply because there is a constituent that will fight for that, because it is in the enlightened self-interest of every New Yorker to have Central Park protected. What Amazon 21 tries to do is to create that enlightened self-interest among indigenous communities, local communities, and governments to realize that what they have today is going to be worth more tomorrow. And protecting it is not only in the interest of the planet, but it's in their self-interest as well. And it provides a financial mechanism to incentivize and sustain it over the long run, particularly through carbon markets.